May 12, 1944, 4:30 in the afternoon, the fields outside the small village of Saint-Jérôme in Normandy, France. The percussion of artillery fire had diminished to sporadic thunder, that terrible distant drumming that meant the front was moving, shifting, collapsing into new configurations. Lieutenant General Friedrich Bauer, 51 years old, commander of the 3rd Panzer Division's artillery sector, stood in what remained of a command post, really just a reinforced dugout with a map table and 2 operational field phones. His adjutant, Captain Helmut Richter, a lean man with nervous eyes, kept one telephone receiver pressed to his ear, listening to increasingly incoherent reports from forward observation posts. The shell came without warning. Not the slow whistle that gave a man perhaps 5 seconds to flinch, to calculate whether he should throw himself flat or run for the concrete shelter. This shell arrived already screaming, already close, already too late. The explosion consumed the dugout in a fury of fire, earth, and fragmented steel. The force of it lifted Bauer off his feet and threw him against the far wall with a violence that felt like being struck by an invisible titan. For one eternal moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't even understand what had happened. His ears sang with a frequency that seemed to originate from inside his own skull. His vision went white, then red, then settled into a darkness punctuated by swirling sparks. When sensation returned, it came as pure pain. His right leg, from hip to knee, was aflame. When he looked down, his eyes moving with the slow, disconnected quality of a man underwater, he saw that his uniform had been shredded. Beneath the torn gray fabric, blood pulsed steadily from a wound that gaped like a mouth, deep and terrible. The shrapnel had entered at an angle, tearing muscle, shattering bone. He could see fragments of white, calcified bone gleaming in the red mess. And he understood with the clarity of shock that he was badly, perhaps mortally, wounded. The pain was enormous. It didn't hurt in the way a cut or a bruise hurts. This was something deeper, more total. This was his body announcing with perfect clarity that it was failing. Captain Richter was dead. Bauer could see him against the far wall, or what remained of the gesture of a man. Blood pooled around something that had once been human, already acquiring the slack appearance of the finished. Bauer tried to sit up. He managed perhaps 6 inches before the world tilted and black ants swarmed across his vision. He fell back against the concrete, and that simple motion sent a fresh explosion of agony through his entire right side. He opened his mouth to call for help, to summon the medics, but his voice came out as a whisper, a sound so small it seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Part 2. The fever and the fall of certainties. The field hospital was a chaos of canvas and suffering. It occupied a requisitioned stone farmhouse outside a village whose name Bauer never learned, where the walls still bore bullet holes from fighting 3 days prior. The hospital staff, overworked, undersupplied, moving with the jerking efficiency of exhaustion, had examined his wound, made assessments, and administered morphine. That had been. How long ago? Hours. Days. Time had become unreliable, a measurement that no longer applied to the world he inhabited. He lay on a narrow cot in what had once been a barn, now converted into a ward for the dying. Around him other men groaned, whimpered, called for mothers and wives and things that could not be given. The smell was indescribable, not merely blood and bodily waste, but the specific reek of exposed tissue beginning to corrupt. The sweetish, sour stench of gangrenous tissue, the bitter chemical smell of the limited antiseptics they possessed. The infection took hold with a speed that seemed almost malevolent. By the 2nd day, or was it the 3rd, Bauer's fever had climbed to a temperature that felt like a separate being inhabiting his body. His skin burned. Sweat poured from him in quantities that seemed impossible, yet his mouth remained parched, his tongue a useless leather thing that belonged to someone else. In his lucid moments, when the morphine and fever temporarily adjusted to a level that permitted thought, Bauer could feel the infection spreading through his blood like an army of occupation. The shrapnel had torn deep into tissue that hospitals lacked the capacity to fully cleanse. In the field, with limited anesthesia and even more limited access to antibiotics, penicillin was still largely reserved for Allied forces. The wound had been simply wrapped and prayed over. The infection had taken root like a demon settling into a new home, expanding its territory with methodical cruelty. On the fourth night, he was certain it was night because the canvas tent glowed with the darkness before dawn quality of a field hospital at 3 in the morning. Bauer experienced something he could only later identify as a kind of philosophical delirium. The fever had climbed to 105 degrees Fahrenheit. His body was shutting down systems, attempting to burn out the infection through the crude tool of internal heat. His conscious mind, starved of blood and oxygen, began to produce visions. He saw rallies. He saw the vast amphitheaters of Nuremberg filled with the neat geometry of 50,000 people, all turned toward the podium where the Reich's leaders spoke of destiny and purity, and the inevitable triumph of will. He saw himself, his younger self, newly promoted, full of conviction that his service was righteous, that the hierarchy he served had purpose beyond merely killing. He remembered believing. With absolute certainty, he had believed. The ideology had filled him like blood filling a vessel. It had seemed not like propaganda, but like truth, like scientific fact, like the natural order of things. Now, burning in delirium on a cot in a barn that smelled of death, Bauer understood with perfect clarity that he had been mad. That the madness had not felt like madness at all. That a man could look into another man's eyes and rationalize terrible things, could close his ears to voices of doubt, could construct an entire mental edifice dedicated to not seeing, not knowing, not hearing. His chest grew tighter. Each breath became a small labor, a minor negotiation with lungs that seemed to be filing a complaint about their fundamental purpose. He thought, this is justice. The thought came not from bitterness, but from a kind of exhausted acceptance. This is what I deserve. This is the body paying the bill that the mind incurred. He thought, I will die here. I will die a prisoner, and they will throw my body into a pit with the others. And my children will learn that their father was not a hero, but a fool. This is right. This is correct. He expected that fate to have a symmetry about it. The man who had served a machine that murdered millions, casually, bureaucratically, with the administrative efficiency of state power, would himself be murdered by an infection that neither cared for his rank nor his beliefs. The machine did not care. The infection did not care. There was a purity in that indifference, and Bauer found himself sinking into it like a man sinking into water. Part 3. The mercy of the Conqueror consciousness returned in fragments. First, sound. The steady rhythmic rumble of engines, the crunch of tires on gravel, the organized shout of American voices. Then, light. Sunlight so bright it seemed like an attack on his exhausted eyes. Then, the understanding that he was no longer in the field hospital, but in something that moved, that bounced with the motion of a vehicle traveling at speed. An American ambulance. The realization came slowly, filtered through layers of fever and pain medication. Americans? Of course, some part of him thought with distant fatalism. The infection did not kill me, so the Americans will. The forward American units had found him during a sweep of captured German positions. A medical officer named Jackson, a man whose face Bauer would see many times in the subsequent years, in dreams and in waking life, had made a rapid assessment. Infection, sepsis beginning, wound contaminated, and days into corruption. Prognosis, if left untreated, death within 48 hours, 97% certainty. What Jackson saw was not a German general. Jackson saw a man dying with a wound that modern medicine, American medicine, with its supply of penicillin and its access to equipment, might address. This distinction, this refusal to see the uniform and rank as moral predicates for treatment, would alter the trajectory of Friedrich Bauer's life. Bauer was loaded into the ambulance with the same professional efficiency that American medics showed toward wounded American soldiers. Morphine was administered. IV lines were inserted into his arms. A corporal named Martinez, who spoke serviceable German, learned from a grandmother in San Antonio, Texas, bent close to Bauer's ear and said in a slow, clear voice, "You are going to be okay. We are taking you to the surgical hospital. You are going to be okay." Bauer in the fever haze could not determine whether this was truth or mercy dressed as deception. The surgical hospital had been established in a captured German facility, an ironically fitting detail that Bauer would later appreciate with dark humor. It was a building designed and constructed by Nazi engineers for Nazi purposes, now repurposed by American surgeons to save both American and German lives. The operating theater, when they wheeled him into it, seemed to Bauer like paradise and punishment combined, spotless, equipped with instruments that gleamed with the promise of modern medicine, populated by men in masks and surgical whites, who moved with the focused intensity of people engaged in something beyond politics or war. The senior surgeon was a man named Colonel Robert Ashford, a transplant physician from Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, who had volunteered for field duty 3 months prior. Ashford reviewed Bauer's chart, the minimal information that the medics had gathered, and made a rapid decision. "He goes straight to OR3, Ashford said. "Full sepsis protocol. Prep for aggressive debridement. I want penicillin started immediately and run a full blood workup. If we don't get the infected tissue out in the next 3 hours, he becomes a statistic." A young lieutenant named Sarah Chen, one of the few female surgeons in the European theater, was assigned as the anesthesiologist. She looked at Bauer, at the German general in the threadbare uniform, burning with fever, his face sunken with dehydration, and saw not an enemy, but a patient. This distinction, too, would echo forward through time. "I'm going to put you to sleep," she told him in careful German learned from 2 years of study. "When you wake up, your infection will be treated. You will live." Bauer, in the moments before the anesthetic took hold, tried to speak. What emerged was a hoarse whisper. "Why?" Chen's eyes, the only part of her visible above the surgical mask, reflected something that Bauer's fever-damaged brain struggled to categorize. Compassion, duty, simply the refusal to let a man die. "Because we can," she said, and then darkness took him. Part 4. The Shock of Kindness. The surgery lasted 7 hours and 43 minutes. Colonel Ashford, working with the meticulous precision of a man excavating a world historic cancer, removed all contaminated tissue. The shrapnel fragments, pieces of German artillery shell, bitter irony noted, were extracted. Muscle tissue too far gone to save was debrided away. Bone fragments too damaged to remain were removed, leaving Bauer's right leg shorter than his left, a permanent testament to the violence of May 12th. Blood loss during the procedure necessitated 4 transfusions. The penicillin, a precious supply that might have served 20 American soldiers with minor wounds, was poured into Bauer's system in quantities that would have seemed profligate 3 months prior. Ashford worked with his team in the exhausted concentration of men familiar with the boundary between life and death. Each decision carried consequences measured in hours, in organ failure, in the slow collapse of a human body's will to persist. At 11:30 at night, with the operating theater's lights brilliant against the darkness outside, Ashford closed the final suture. "He'll live," Ashford said to the nursing staff, removing his mask. His voice contained no triumph, only the factual observation of a man stating an outcome. "Unless the infection has seeded somewhere we couldn't reach, he'll live." Bauer woke, truly woke, with consciousness returning in a steady flood rather than fragmentary doses 3 days later. The first things he perceived: sunlight through hospital windows, the smell of antiseptic, clean and almost reassuring, the weight of bandages on his right leg, and, most strange of all, the absence of pain. There was discomfort, yes, the dull ache of healing wounds, but not the searing agony of those fevered days in the field hospital. A nurse was beside him, a young woman with reddish hair and a face that bore the particular tiredness of people who had been awake for too long, too many times in succession. Her name was Eleanor Garrison from Tuskegee, Alabama, and she had served as a nurse in the Pacific before being reassigned to Europe 2 months prior. "Welcome back," she said in English. Then, with evident effort at pronunciation, "Willkommen." Bauer tried to speak. His throat was raw. The intubation tube had left its mark. What emerged was a sound like wind through broken windows. Garrison held water to his lips. Cool water. Water, Bauer realized in that moment, was the finest thing that had ever existed. It was absurd, this sudden awareness, but it was absolute. "You are at the casualty clearing station near Le Mans," Garrison explained slowly, with the careful enunciation used with non-native speakers. "You have been in surgery. Your infection is treated. You are a prisoner of war, but you are now a prisoner who will live." The information seemed to arrive from very far away, transmitted across vast distances of space or time or consciousness. "My leg," Bauer managed to say, the words scraping up from his damaged throat. "You will walk," Garrison said, not quite truthfully. The limp would be permanent. The phantom pain would haunt him for years. But you will walk. Over the subsequent days, as his consciousness solidified and the morphine hazed gradually cleared, Bauer began to perceive something that his fever-addled mind had failed to grasp before. These Americans, these enemy soldiers, these conquerors, were not treating him with contempt. On the second day of his recovery, Colonel Ashford himself came to examine the wound. He was a man in his late 50s, with gray threading through his hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to making decisions of consequence. He spent 15 minutes examining Bauer's leg, checking circulation, assessing the healing tissue, asking Garrison quiet questions about infection signs. He said nothing about Bauer's uniform, his rank, his service to the regime that America was fighting to destroy. He said only, "The healing is progressing well. You're a strong man, General Bauer. The infection didn't take hold as deeply as we feared." On the fourth day, 2 of the surgical team came to see him, a young lieutenant, the same Chen who had anesthetized him, and a private named Williams, who assisted in the operating room. They didn't stay long. Chen simply said, "You are healing very well. This is good." It was the ordinariness of it, Bauer realized, that was most shocking. There was no gloating, no contempt, no recitation of his crimes or his ideology's crimes. There was simply the ordinary machinery of medicine functioning. There was the simple, evident fact that these men, these Americans whom Nazi propaganda had described as race-mixed degenerates incapable of serious military thought, had fought for his life with the same technical precision and human commitment that they would have applied to any patient. It violated something fundamental in the structure of Bauer's understanding of the world. On the 6th day, as he was being moved to a more permanent POW hospital facility farther from the front, Bauer found pen and paper left beside his bed. With his left hand, his right shoulder still heavily bandaged, he began to write a letter to his family, then stopped. What could he tell them? That he had been saved by the enemy. That the men they had been taught to regard as less than human had preserved his life at the expense of supplies and time and moral energy that could have been allocated elsewhere. He started again. "My dear Margaret and children." And then he could not continue. The certainties he had carried for decades seemed to be dissolving like salt in water, becoming less real with each moment that passed. Part 5. The prison becomes a university. The POW camp near Orléans held approximately 12,000 German prisoners. It was, by the standards of the time, relatively humane. Adequate rations, basic medical care, minimal violence from guards. The Americans, it seemed, were winning the war decisively enough that they could afford to treat prisoners as humans rather than as disposable resources. Bauer was assigned to a section for officers. His leg, though healing, required continued medical attention. A German doctor named Stern, captured at the Battle of Normandy, continued to monitor the wound and assess Bauer's progress. "You are extraordinarily fortunate," Stern told him in German, after examining the wound a week into Bauer's time at the camp. "An infection like that, a month ago, would have meant amputation. 2 months ago, it would have meant death. The penicillin alone, do you understand how precious that is? They used enough penicillin to treat perhaps 100 soldiers with routine infections." "I know," Bauer said, and then, "Why?" Stern, a thin man with the exhausted look of someone who had spent the war attempting to save lives in impossible circumstances, shrugged, because they could, because they chose to. The weeks became months. Bauer's leg strengthened. The limp became permanent but functional. The phantom pain, a strange sensation as if his nerve endings were still reporting from tissue that no longer existed, became something he could set aside for hours at a time. The camp had a library maintained by cooperative guards and American officers who had concluded that keeping prisoners engaged with reading material was more practical than allowing them to fester in boredom. It was here that Bauer began his education in earnest, not the education he had received at military academy, not the education he had absorbed through 12 years of Nazi governance, but something entirely different. He read John Steinbeck. He read Pearl Buck. He read essays about American democracy and American history. He attended discussions led by other prisoners, a philosophy professor from Berlin, a journalist from Munich, men who had begun to grapple with the same questions that Bauer was asking. How had a nation become convinced of its own righteousness while committing abominations? How does ideology colonize the mind? In November, nearly 6 months after his wound, Bauer was selected for an American military hospital routine check. The wound was healed. The infection never returned. He was reassigned to general camp duties, light work given his leg. It was during these routine tasks that he encountered Colonel Ashford again. Ashford was visiting the camp in an official capacity, reviewing medical records, overseeing the health of American personnel and certain of the high-value prisoners. He recognized Bauer immediately. "General," Ashford said with a nod. "How is the leg?" "Functional," Bauer replied, speaking English now with increasing confidence. "Good, strong. I walk without assistance." "Good," Ashford said. "That was always the goal." And then he paused, seeming to consider something. "I read about you after the surgery. Your record. What I found troubled me greatly." Bauer felt something tighten in his chest. This finally was the moment of reckoning. This was when the moral account would be settled. "I was a surgeon first," Ashford continued, "and an officer second. When I was training in Baltimore before this war, one of my professors, a man named Dr. Aaron Goldstein, taught me that the duty of a physician transcends nationality. He taught me that the body's pain is a universal language, and that to treat suffering is an obligation that exists above all other loyalties." He looked at Bauer directly. "Dr. Goldstein was a Jew. He was killed in the camps. We received word in 1944. The Nazis considered him less than human because of his blood. Yet I saved your life using principles he taught me. I did so not in spite of your record, but in affirmation of principles that transcend whatever you served or believed." Ashford turned to leave, then paused. "I'm not absolving you of anything, General. I'm simply stating the fact that a physician's obligation to preserve life remains even when that life belongs to someone who may not deserve it. I hope in the time remaining to you, you consider what that means." Part 6. The Reconstruction of a Man. The war ended in May of 1945. By September, the first waves of German prisoners began to be repatriated. Bauer, classified as high value and potentially complicit in war crimes due to his proximity to high command, remained in custody. The interrogations were thorough and methodical. He was questioned about operations he had authorized, decisions he had made, orders he had given. The men he had killed, directly and indirectly, accumulated into a number that seemed impossible, abstract, unreal. In the spring of 1946, approximately 2 years after his capture, Bauer was finally released. Germany was a rubble heap. His home in Wiesbaden had been destroyed in bombing raids. His wife had survived, living in a small cottage outside the city. His son had been killed at Stalingrad in 1943. His daughter had survived. They received him with a kind of stunned disbelief. The man who returned was not the man who had departed, not merely because he limped or because he had aged or because he carried the exhausted look of someone who had traveled great distances through interior darkness. He was fundamentally altered in ways that his family struggled to comprehend. He began attending lectures at the University of Mainz in 1946. Medicine. He was 53 years old, with a limp and a past that would follow him for the remainder of his life, and he began studying medicine with the intensity of a man attempting to rebuild his fundamental understanding of what it meant to be human. His classmates were half his age, many of them also veterans, also scarred by the war, also attempting to forge new identities in the ruins of the old world. Some of them recognized who he was. Some asked him about his service. He did not lie about it. "I was part of a machine," he told a young student named Klaus one afternoon in 1947. "I did not think about what the machine did. I simply functioned. When I was wounded, I expected to be punished by the enemy. Instead, I was saved. An American surgeon used precious antibiotics and irreplaceable time and his extraordinary skill to preserve my life. He did this despite my record, despite the ideology I had served. He did this because he was a physician first and a human being first." Klaus, a boy of 22 who had fought in the Wehrmacht and survived the entire war without serious injury, asked, "Why does that matter?" "Because," Bauer said, "it showed me that redemption is possible. Not forgiveness. I do not believe in forgiveness for what I have done, but the possibility of becoming something other than what I was. That is what Colonel Ashford's mercy demonstrated." He completed his medical degree in 1950. He was 57 years old. His specialization was internal medicine, with an emphasis on infectious disease. For 12 years, he practiced medicine in Mainz and Frankfurt, treating patients with meticulous attention and a kind of almost obsessive dedication to the preservation of life. He treated American soldiers still in Germany, treated Soviet prisoners being repatriated, treated German civilians, treated people without distinction regarding their background or what they might have done during the war. Part 7. The Written Reckoning. In 1958, at the age of 65 and facing approaching retirement, Bauer published a book. It was titled, in German, Die Pflicht des Offiziers, Menschlichkeit als Strategie. In English, The Duty of the Officer, Humanity as Strategy. It was not an apology. Apologies, Bauer had concluded, were too easy. They allowed the apologizer to absolution without requiring transformation. Instead, the book was a meditation on moral responsibility, on the ways that ideology colonizes thought, and on the power of individual action to create the possibility of redemption. He wrote about his capture, his wound, his fever, and his treatment by American surgeons. He did not sensationalize these experiences. He presented them as facts, brutal, simple, undeniable facts, and allowed readers to extract their own moral conclusions. He wrote, "I expected death. I expected punishment. What I received instead was mercy from men who were under no obligation to provide it. This act of mercy was not forgiveness. It was something more important. It was a demonstration of what humanity could be when individuals chose to act according to conscience rather than according to the categories into which they had been sorted." He continued, "We are taught that the enemy is less than human, that their suffering is deserved, that their death is not tragic, but logical. I believed all of this. I was, by every measure available in 1944, a committed participant in a system dedicated to genocide. Yet when I was dying, men whom I was taught to regard as degenerate and inferior to my race preserved my life. This is not irony. This is the fundamental contradiction that lies at the heart of ideology. It attempts to construct reality according to its theories, but reality, human reality, persists in insisting on its own complexity. The book found a modest audience in Germany and Austria, where the process of national reckoning with the Nazi past was still in its early stages. It was praised by some as an important moral witness and attacked by others as self-serving redemption-seeking. Bauer did not defend himself against the attacks. "They are not entirely wrong," he told his daughter Margaret, who had become a lawyer and who urged him to respond to critics. "There is always an element of self-interest in the act of bearing witness, but the facts remain true regardless of the observer's motivation." The book was eventually translated into English and published in the United States in 1960. It found readers among American educators and military personnel who regarded it as a useful document in thinking through the moral questions that the war had raised. Colonel Robert Ashford, retired by then and living in Baltimore with his wife, read a copy. He wrote a letter to Bauer, a letter that took weeks to navigate the postal systems between the United States and West Germany. In it, Ashford wrote simply, "General, I read your book. You have done something I could not do. You have translated the individual act of medical care into a meditation on moral possibility. I am grateful. I performed surgery on you not thinking it would contribute to such a book, yet here we are, and the mercy of that moment has become larger than either of us. I hope that wherever you are at peace. You certainly have earned it." Bauer received the letter on a Tuesday afternoon in November of 1961. He read it 3 times. He wept. He had not wept since his son's death had been confirmed in 1943. Part 8. The Legacy of a Single Moment. Friedrich Bauer died on March 14, 1974. He was 81 years old. His obituary in the German newspapers identified him as a former Wehrmacht general, a medical doctor, and an advocate for reconciliation and moral responsibility in the post-war world. Some papers mentioned the book. Some noted his service in Nazi Germany. Most seemed uncertain how to categorize a man whose life had contained such fundamental contradictions. But what mattered was what endured. The book remained in circulation. It was assigned in military academies and ethics courses. It was read by people attempting to understand how ordinary men become complicit in extraordinary evil, and how, alternatively, ordinary acts of mercy can propagate consequences far beyond their initial moment. The surgical team that had saved Bauer's life dispersed across the world after the war. Colonel Ashford returned to Johns Hopkins, where he became a prominent transplant surgeon. Lieutenant Sarah Chen joined a hospital in San Francisco. Eleanor Garrison returned to Alabama and became a nursing educator. They were, in many ways, ordinary people who did ordinary things in extraordinary circumstances. Yet their ordinariness was precisely the point. The war had been won by nations and armies, by strategies and technologies, by the mobilization of entire populations. But the peace, if it was to mean anything at all, would be built by individuals like these, people willing to see a human being where ideology insisted on seeing an enemy, willing to invest resources and effort in preserving a life that the logic of total war suggested should be allowed to end. On a spring afternoon in 1958, a former Wehrmacht general published a book. In that book, he described with precision and without sentimentality how an American surgeon had saved his life, and how that act had led over the years to a transformation that had enabled him to write about responsibility, redemption, and the possibility of becoming other than what one had been. He did not present this as a simple story of good defeating evil, or of a good deed being rewarded. He presented it as something far more complex and far more true. The story of how a single act of mercy, expanded outward through thought and reflection and commitment to building something new, could become larger than the individuals involved in that moment. The shrapnel that had shattered Friedrich Bauer's leg on that May afternoon in 1944 had been German artillery. The hand that had saved him had been American. The ideology that had created the war that produced the shrapnel had attempted to construct a reality in which healing across such divisions was impossible, in which the category enemy was meant to be absolute and permanent. Yet here was Bauer, walking with a limp for the rest of his life, carrying with him the knowledge that he had been saved by the very people he had been taught to hate, and that this act of salvation had become the beginning of his liberation. The scar tissue healed, the leg strengthened, the wound closed. But the transformation it had catalyzed, the slow, agonizing reconstruction of a human being's fundamental understanding of what it meant to be human, that never fully healed. And perhaps Bauer came to believe that was precisely how it should be.